So as Richard said, I'm Richard Saunders, I'm the Contensis product owner, and so I set the vision and help set the roadmap for Contensis. Since we were here last, which was, 476 days ago since the last rocket, a lot's gone on. There's been 5 Contensis releases, and 11.3 is just around the corner. So my talk is going to be focused on Contensis, and I think it's really important to understand where I'm coming from setting the roadmap of Contensis, where my areas of focus are. So the first is around content modeling, basically shaping and structuring your content for now and in the future. Around the creation, the easy authoring of content in a familiar interface that's easy to use, and also not only in a single language, but in multiple languages. We have governance, so setting things out for your organization, from workflow to roles and permissions, around reporting. These are an important aspect of content and content strategy, and these are areas of tooling that we are focusing on. And then there's the delivery. Currently through our delivery API, both HTTP, JavaScript, and .NET. And as Richard mentioned later on this afternoon, he's going to be touching on the web publishing platform and the future of web publishing. And that delivery segment is really where the connection happens between content types and entries and web publishing. So I'm not going to touch on web publishing. I'm going to focus on these 4 themes throughout this morning's talk. And hopefully you get a bit of an understanding of the direction that we've taken. So let's start with modeling, shaping and structuring your content. As Richard said, so many devices are consuming content in different ways, and we want to make sure your content is shaped in a way that allows for that reuse. You might not have a need for an Amazon Echo app at the moment, or a mobile application where you want to get that data into, but if you start thinking about shaping and modeling that content now, it is going to be ready for you to reuse. So in the past, we've provided tools such as the content type builder, giving you the ability to structure this content and shape that content into its smaller part, into its chunks. And this came out in version 9 of Contensis. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're just around the corner to releasing 11.3. So I'm going to summarize some of the features that have come out in the last 15 months. Some of you might have seen some of these. Some of this might be a refresher for individuals. And as Richard said, if there's any questions throughout the day, please come and find one of us. We're really keen to talk about this stuff and how you can be using it. So the first thing I want to touch on is components. So whilst a content type allows you to define a piece of content, such as a course or an event or a piece of news or a blog post, components basically allow us to create chunks of content that might be used across multiple content types. So think of these as smaller things. We've got things like addresses, Twitter cards, so sending the title, the description, and a particular image that should be shared over social networking platforms. All these are pieces of content that represent your core content. So an event, you might have a specific title and messaging that you want to use on Twitter over the general summary and description that you may display on your website. So creating these components means you can drop them into any type of content and reuse them. Along with components, we introduced the idea of repeatable fields. So this allows you to define something like an address and say, I want to include 3 addresses within this entry. So I might want to provide a home address, a business address, and an alternative address. You could create an address component and just say, I want to allow multiple of these on the screen. This makes it really easy for an author to populate that content, but it also makes it really easy for a developer to get hold of that content, so they can just say, get me address.home, get me address.business, get me address.alternative, and get hold of those fields in the appropriate way. There were ways of doing this previously with composers, but composers allow content of different types to be mixed together. So whilst they're still structured, they're fundamentally not the same type of information. So sometimes a composer makes more sense. Scientific results, maybe, set of blood results that you might want to repeat. A set of opening times could be another component where it makes sense to define a day and a time range that's appropriate for maybe a shop or a venue opening times. So all these things can now be achieved with a combination of components and repeatable fields. Whilst we've provided ways of creating content as individuals, as authors in these screens, sometimes content gets consumed from other places. Things like other systems that you might have. So I know some of the museums have got large museum collections. This data sits in an external system that they want to bring into their website. And all this content can be imported to content types and entries and output to these different outputs that we've talked about earlier, web pages, mobile devices, voice devices like the Amazon Echo. But at the moment, a developer has to set up the content type within the content type builder UI and can't do this programmatically. So if he wanted to carry out an import on the fly and build up that content and shape that content model, at the moment you'd have to create it through the user interface. We're going to be introducing the ability to create content types through our management API. We've been meaning to do this for a little while. There's a lot of work to do at the moment. The user interface basically carries out all the validation for us to check that the right data is in the right data format, that we're capturing that in the right way. So we're building a validation framework at the moment that's validating that from the management API as well. So in due course, that will be coming out. So we'll be able to do things like this. We'll be able to set out imports and exports of content types. So if you want to move from a development system to a production system, you could easily export that content type or selection of content types in your content model to easily import and export that into other systems. So that covered the modeling of content that we're doing. But also, one of the key factors is people are actually producing this content in your organization. They're sitting behind a screen, populating content, writing content. So this is obviously a key area for us. And one of the pieces of friction that has been apparent is when you're breaking your content down into much smaller parts. So if you had a book and you're creating an author, for example, before the 11.2 release, where inline entries was introduced, you'd have to create a book, and then you'd have to come out of that book because you didn't have a new author that you wanted to create. You then create the subsequent author, go back into the book, and assign the two things together. So inline entries makes this really feasible. You can scroll down, so we've got a summary field here. Here's the author field. I'm going to select an existing author at the moment. Roald Dahl is the only author that I've got in the system. I could try a search. I'm actually writing Erin Kassane for the Elements and Content Strategy book. But now I can say create a new author, and I'm going into the screen and I'm populating the author information. So add in Erin Kassane. I'll go down and add a summary shortly. I've made a spelling mistake. You see the new slug editor, which I'll touch on later. So the summary gets populated. I can go and add an image that's already uploaded to the system. So I'll insert that. And then I can go and add her Twitter details a little bit further down. And I can publish that entry out straight away, or I could send that off for approval, so that author can be approved. And then that author is added to that entry. Now, sometimes when you're modeling content, you might make a mistake or might want to go back and edit that entry, so you can actually click edit on that author and go back in and populate additional fields. Now, this is all linked to our roles and permissions model. So if authors are only created by certain individuals, only those individuals will see the create a new author option. People who can't create it will just be able to view that content in the inline flyout. So we think that's going to really simplify the creation of content and within multiple content types, allowing you to keep that content broken down into much smaller parts to be reused across other content types, but in a really simple way. So, much to a lot of people's delight, you can now unpublish entries. You can do this both in the listing and within the entry editor itself, so you can just select the actions menu at the top and select unpublish. Along with that, you can copy entries, so if you've got entries of similar types, sometimes you might have a product, for example, that's just got a slight variation. You can copy an existing product, modify some details, maybe change the photo, maybe change the pricing, or an event that happens on a reoccurring time, just duplicate that event, update the date and time, saves your authors having to do loads and loads of work. So copy entries is also in there. When we introduce content types and entries, we display all your images and assets in our asset gallery and in our image gallery. Now, this makes it really difficult to locate images that maybe aren't, well, that you want to be particularly related. So in the book example earlier, you might have a folder of book covers, or you might have a product with a folder of product photos. You can now restrict those image and asset fields to a particular folder or set of folders. So if the content exists in multiple folders, you can set a list of folder properties. And then the asset gallery will only return that information, making it easier for your authors to select that content. But again, to much people's delight, we've done inline entries, and in 11.3 we'll be introducing inline upload of that content. So if you've got an image field, so I come back to my book cover example, click on Browse, select a local file browser, select the images that you want to upload. You can do single or multiple. I'm showing in this example selecting from a file browser, but you can actually drag and drop from your local machine. You can actually drag and drop from the tree. You can drag and drop from the quick search at the top of the screen. So if content's already in the CMS, you can open up the navigator tree, drill down to where you want it, and just drag that content out and drop it in. Content gets uploaded to a folder that you specify within the content type. So the book example, I assigned my image uploads to go to my image library /books, so that all the book covers are kept in one place. And it starts to make you think about actually organizing your assets into a true folder structure that we might later on turn into smart collections and albums and so on and so forth. So that's inline upload for images and assets. To go along with this, we need a way of sometimes cropping or defining regions of an image that might be used. So you might have uploaded quite a large image from your digital camera, maybe of a campus building or of a group of people. And in this situation, you might use that content in multiple places across your site or within for specific uses. So in one scenario, you might want the whole photo used as a banner image at the top of your page. So you want to be able to crop to that banner image. You might just want to crop someone's face and just use that face maybe in a listing or a reference point to it. With the image editor now, you'll be able to set what we're calling transforms on an image field. So you'll be able to go to the content type, my book cover example. I want to specify that the book cover should be in portrait orientation. I want it by, I don't know, 240 pixels wide by 340 pixels high. So we've set that constraint. When a person uploads an image to the image upload, it will display in the image editor with that crop defined. They can then zoom that image in and out. And when they click apply, we don't actually take a crop of it. In the past, in the WYSIWYG editor, you drop an image in, we create a variation for it, we've got loads of size variations, we've got duplication of content. We don't do any of that. We just keep a reference of the coordinates, of the crop size. And we're going to do other things as well. Orientation. Want to straighten out that image, do that, flip it horizontally and vertically, and even set the quality. So because the image transforms are going to align with our new image API, which I'll touch on later on, we actually pass all this information to the image API, which crops that image on the fly, applies the quality setting that you've defined, giving you really well-performant images, which I'm going to touch on in a little bit more detail later on. I'm really excited about this because it just allows you to start doing things like want to define responsive images, Combine our components that I mentioned earlier on. Create yourself a responsive image component. Specify a banner, a thumbnail, a mobile view. Add that component to a content type or a composer if you need to, and then your users can select a predefined set of images, and you can use suddenly the picture element that you've been wanting to use before to do art-directed images. If you want to create adverts and art-directed adverts, create a component for adverts. This is going to enable real powerful abilities with content types and entries. Again, not duplicating content, using the same content multiple ways. So there's a whole host of other editing experiences that we want to add to the entry editor. So we're looking to add in a code editor into content types and entries. This will allow you to create code snippets, define a language that code snippet is. So for example, for us, this will come in handy for ZenHub, so we can actually display our code examples in our own content types and entries. We know some of you write a lot of long-form content, blog posts, news articles, and our original thinking around the composer field was a way of being able to bring structure to the writing experience, but it hasn't worked quite as well as we'd hoped. So we're going to look at a particular writing experience that we're going to call Canvas. And this will be restricted to certain types of content, images, quotes, video content, embeds. So it's really, if you're going to be creating a blog post or stuff like that, it will allow you to create that kind of rich content, copy and paste stuff in from Word, do auto formatting of the stuff that comes in from Word and that comes alongside, copying it in from Markdown and pasting Markdown in and then seeing that converted to clear text. None of the kind of thinking of HTML, it won't be saved as HTML, we'll probably save it as static JSON in the background, so it's really clean. And another feature, which I'll touch on shortly, will be another reason why we're doing it. So embeds, embeds are going to enable us to preview things like YouTube videos, Vimeo links, Twitter cards and social sharing. So if you're adding those into your entry, maybe into a news article or into a composer field, the user's going to get feedback to actually what they've pasted in. Is it the right video? Did I copy the right? Is it the music video I've just been listening to or the company product video that I should have been pasting into that entry? Time. I mentioned opening times earlier, and at the moment opening times have to be defined using a text field because our date time records true UTC, date and time, so we have to bundle that information together to make sure that data and data format is correct. So we're looking at bringing time, which allows us to do things like time range, time duration, and so on and so forth. And this won't just be an editor behavior, this will be a delivery API behavior as well, so you can make calls of how long is the shop open for today? It's open for 6 hours, and so on and so forth. So looking into that at the moment. Big one for us, which we're really excited about, is collaborating on entries with multiple authors. We've got this in prototyping at the moment, where we've got multiple people coming in, so you'll be able to see who's currently on that entry and is using that entry. You'll see what fields that they're currently editing. And I mentioned earlier on about the writing canvas. Because we're storing that information as JSON, we can work out exactly what character that they're on, what selection that they've made, so we can start bringing collaboration to long-form content. This is really exciting, and that's hopefully beginning to come out in the next couple of releases. So we're going to be spending some time on that shortly. So that's content creation, a really important aspect of Contensis. Some of those features will make it much easier to start transitioning over to content types and entries and using it for more types of content. So governance. Governance is, as I said earlier, is about setting and defining organization, workflows, permissions, reporting, all that stuff that people need to get an eye on or ensure content is produced in a particular way. So a few releases ago, we released Workflow, and this enabled us to do additional things. So when we shipped Contensis 9, you had this sense of basic workflow. Create the content, publish, made immediately available. Now this is fine if you've got a scenario where, you've got a comms team who are responsible for your news articles on the site. Nobody actually authors it except the comms team. They're okay with that content being published immediately. And I think this is the important thing to remember, because you're dealing with chunks of content and much more smaller portions of content. you've got far more greater control of being able to say, these people are just responsible for authors, these people are just responsible for venues. So basic workflow makes sense in those scenarios. But sometimes content needs approving. Somebody else needs to get their eyes on it before it's published. So with the new workflow engine, we were able to do approval. This is the same as web pages today. But it also allows us under the hood to start defining custom workflow. In ZenHub, for example, when I write a ZenHub article, I might pass it to a colleague for technical review that needs to be validated that the information I'm writing is correct. This then gets passed on to Noel in order to do an editorial review, make sure the tone and voice is right. These are two separate stages of approval. Actually, I don't want to just send it to a group of 50 people. I want to send it to specific groups of people with a particular need. So actually in the background, because we've built the workflow engine as a really adaptable engine, if you wanted to define a 10, 12-step workflow for your content, you can. Now, there's no user interface at the moment, and that's something that we want to bring later next year. However, if you've got a particular project need, work with our professional services team and we can help you define the JSON in the background to be able to create these custom workflows. So that's something that we can do with you. So custom workflow, and along with that came roles and permissions. So roles allow us to get a centralized views of permissions across the system. If anybody's applied permissions in the Navigator tree today, they know how much of a headache it can be. You can set up permissions in so many different ways. You can propagate permissions. And sometimes you might have hundreds of assignments, and then sometimes you might have thousands of assignments. It's great to have flexibility, but no good if you're trying to manage it and understand it. With roles and permissions, we've brought content types and entries permissioning. We want to extend this at a later date to other areas of the system. But at the moment, it's obviously earmarked content types and entries, but you can imagine things like user management, taxonomy management, and all that type of things, that different resources that we can bring into this centralized roles management screen. And it's fairly easy to set up. So imagine you're working on a multilingual site. There are a group of people who look after news articles, and they're just translating them into French. Well, actually, you could just set up a French translator for news content. And all they can do is create it and submit it for approval. You could create another role then to say, I'm a multilingual approver. These group of people can look at all that content and approve that content. So you can assign permissions really granularly by content type, the actions that they can carry out, as well as in what language that you want them to do those things in. Version history in entries. We've actually been saving the version history information ever since we released content types and entries. So every action that's been carried out, every field that's been populated, we've known about this stuff and it's been in the background. We've actually always been able to bring up a technical representation of one entry in a previous version to another, but we've never surfaced it in the user interface. So in 11.3, you can now do version history, so you'll get a side-by-side comparison of the content of the entry that you're looking at, very similar to the send for approval screen. So you can compare one version with the current version and see what's changed. So in this example, the poster image has changed on this film. You can see those fields are highlighted, that they've been updated since that version. And then if you want to revert a particular piece of content, you don't need to revert the whole version, just select the pieces of content that are changed. And you get a full version history on the right-hand side. So drilling down again with the user avatar that's being taken. The next version will see the avatar just as their name, and then we're going to introduce their photo when we can crop their photo in bits and pieces. So you'll start actually seeing visual representations of who's been involved in that content. And that goes through all point revisions as well. So if you've made 20 changes before hitting publish, you'll be able to revert back to those particular point changes as well. Read-only permission. So you've got people in your organization that just need to get a view of that content. We want to make that available. We also want to be able to restrict the delivery API to a particular content type. So if you're doing open data and want your delivery API to an output, I was talking to Jack earlier, I think Bristol Council output all their drop curve information and all the gradients of their hills. So they've I know somebody who's produced an app that allows you to work out if an electric wheelchair can actually take a route from location A to B, because they published the information about the gradients and where the drop curbs are, so a wheelchair or pushchair can go down correctly. By introducing read-only permissions on a particular content type, you can make that data available for someone to consume in a mobile app, and so on and so forth. So read-only permission will have a UI reason and a delivery API reason as well. Field groups and permissions. Some content types I've seen as I've been exploring some of them grow to quite large forms. And this is great because the content's broken down, but when it comes to authoring that content, it can seem quite complex. And after all, you're defining the user experience for your users when you're creating your content types. If you decide to put 100 fields in there and expect them to fill them all out and not break it down into separate chunks, that's partly your game, but it's partly for us as well to come up with solutions to help with that layout and things. So I'll use a university course as an example. You might have a bunch of UCAS information that could be separated into a tab or into a group. You might have module information that could be separated into another tab of information. So we're looking at providing different ways of grouping, both in a tabular way across the top of the screen and individually as grouping these sets of fields together. Because this will allow us to permission them as well. So if you want people to just update UCAS information, you can just use the roles and permissions builder and say, these people can access this content type, of course, but the only fields that they can edit are the UCAS tab. So they get to view all that content, but then can just drill down and edit that information. You might do it with a product as well. So product pricing and specific product changes you don't want anyone else modifying, you could assign that to a group of people as well. So field groups and permissions. Sometimes content needs to come off your site or application at a set date and time. Sometimes you need to push content out on a specific date or in a few months' time, and you're getting that content prepared. We want to introduce publish and expiration dates. Again, we want to bring with that at a later date more release scheduling. But again, this will be a new microservice that allows you to gather bunches of entries of different types, put them into a release of, I don't know, Christmas 2019. All that content's created, and on that date, all that content will go out immediately at that time. Not necessarily waiting for publishing queues because it's just going in entry format, but that will come a bit later on. So that's content governance, a whole suite of tools to help you manage that content with some exciting features to come. And the next is around consuming this content, different ways of getting this content out. So when we first released content types and entries in version 9, you're able to get out of the delivery API all entry information and assets that were in your system. When we talk about assets, we mean images, PDFs, documents, and stuff like that. That was all available through the delivery API. As time went on, the delivery API uses Elasticsearch in the background to search upon this stuff, so you can get some really good ranking and understanding of that content. We introduced web pages to this content, so now you could create a search that combined stuff from traditional web page content that you've already got in your system alongside with content types and entries. We've recently added external links. The hyperlink content type wasn't included, so if you've created links to external services that relate to your content, that can now be ranked within the delivery API search. I won't touch on this too long, but if you imagine Contensis being a central content repository of all your content, you can use our management API to bring content in from other systems, research systems, other databases, other CMSs, bring it into an entry, and then centrally within your search then, you can start searching everything across all your databases in one central way using the ranking system provided by Elasticsearch. Really, really powerful. And King's College London, they've been building their search with content types and entries in the delivery API. They're beginning to bring in research data that as you carry out your search, you can start to drill down, you can start to do faceted searching on those search results and so on and so forth. And that's all possible with the delivery API today. Performance of content, returning content from the delivery API through the search traditionally brought back every piece of information about that content type. So if you created that course entry I referred to earlier, you've got a lot of data that could be returned in that search. So we implemented reducing the content payload. So the left-hand side gave an example of Leon Professional film earlier, and this is all the content that represents that particular film. But in a search result, I just might want the title and the description. I don't need all that data to be passed to somebody on their mobile, especially if your search has returned 2,000 results that you're displaying in one long list. That's 2,000 lots of all this content, but I just need 2 fields. So you can now specify the fields that you want to return in your search, reducing the payload, getting it faster to people's devices, and not trying to deal with this monolith of content that you don't need. So it's payload performance. Part of the web publishing platform will need an understanding of the uniqueness of the content that's in the CMS. At the moment, when you use content types and entries, lots of people who've implemented routing and displaying content on their site have defined a field within their content type to say, what is the page name, essentially? And they've been expecting authors to create a sanitized name. So I don't know, this is my web page. They've been expected to type in this -is -my web page. It's a bit rubbish, especially if the title of the entry is this is my web page or this is my event. So with automatic slug generation now, we'll sanitize, it's set on the title field in an option in the content type. And in the top field now, you'll see the title and the slug generated and sanitized as the user types in that information. It's also unique, so when we come to do URL lookups at a later date, we know that there's an event called this title, and we're not looking through 3 of the same name. So yeah, you can use that today. If you've already implemented page title and you want to use this, you could use the management API to migrate the data from one field to use this as well. You'd probably want to flag duplicate fields so you can address the changes in those particular entries. So you could migrate to using this. And this will put you in a good place when we release the web publishing platform, because we'll be using this unique identifier as part of the navigation API. So you're aware of that. So yeah, there's the slug. Again, come and look at my slides afterwards. Co-compare. I showed you version history and comparing versions of entry content. And I've had a couple of conversations with people on Slack, which is a great way to kind of communicate your suggestions. Actually, can we do this with code content? Let's see different versions of a razor view between something that was published 3 months ago and was working and the current version that's not working. Or suddenly the styling has changed on my site. Who's been changing my CSS file? Like, what elements have been changed? So now you can do code compare, so you can get a side-by-side view of your code. Shows all the changes on the left-hand screen that have changed to the right-hand side. You can cycle through those versions and cycle through each individual change and see those changes highlighted. So you can see the colors have changed, the width and dimensions have changed in this example. Gives you a real insight to actually what's happened. So you've got code comparison as well. Image upload, I mentioned earlier, and asset upload. You can now do this with the management API, so you'll be able to create an import from another system, and rather than using the web API and our management API, you can just use the management API to take it all through one route. We're trying to really simplify everything by bringing it into one set of APIs. So that's management upload. And this is the other exciting part for me. I talked about image upload and image cropping, so all that stuff around transformations earlier suddenly allows you to do some unique stuff. So I think this is the Bubble Nebula. Seems right that we're at We the Curious and going to do the planetarium later. But if you download this image from NASA, it's about 11 meg. In fact, the dimensions here, so it's 11.6 megabyte. Well, with our new image API, you can start applying parameters which can come from the image transforms that you've defined, or you can use this afterwards and actually define it in code. So you can do things like, I'll just set the width to 2,560 pixels now, and suddenly the weight of that image is down to 11.1 meg. You can start changing the format and applying different qualities, and you can reduce it down to 45K with not much image loss. And again, so this is an example, I've scaled it down to 600 pixels, given it a 50% quality. That 11 meg has gone to 45K. if I use Google's WebP format, I can now get it down to 24K. And actually, with not much more image loss, if I take the quality down to 85%, I can actually bring it down with WebP to 9.4K from 11 meg. No more do you need those 11 meg images displayed on your website because an author's uploaded it and seemed appropriate to drag it in to a placeholder. And by the way, we put an image handle in as well, so you can use this with existing web page content to use the new image API. So yeah, you're going to get loads of benefits from this. The other advantage is you can use the picture element, you can use source set and start specifying multiple variations of that same content in source set and let the browser determine which is the appropriate size to download to the user's device. Again, getting more performance to that front-end experience. So Image API is going to bring a load of benefits. There's a load of other improvements, a host of things that have changed. Remember, check out the What's New. There's loads of information on the What's New. You can see on ZenHub what everything has gone into every single version. You can change the version in the drop-down, see it by bugs, updates, improvements, new features. So keep an eye out on the What's New page. If you've got any suggestions, feedback, want to have a conversation, I've got some ideas, use the Slack channel. A number of you are really active in there. Some of the suggestions actually get implemented when we have a conversation about them. There's the open roadmap as well. When ideas have come to a certain point of conversation on Slack, we move them to the open roadmap for voting. We don't just use the votes as a means of like this feature will be developed, but we use it alongside our roadmap planning to determine if that's a sensible feature to deliver as part of an ongoing release. So keep an eye on the open roadmap as well. And that's the update from today. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, come and find me. During one of the breaks, I'll be more than happy to talk about content types and entries in Contensis as a whole. Thanks very much.